When you mention embroidery, many people will immediately think of elegant ladies from bygone eras stitching away in their drawing rooms, producing such now obsolete items as tray cloths and dressing table sets. But this is a craft that has left this very dated image where it belongs, most definitely in the past. Embroidery can be found everywhere, and with new technologies offering such treasures as dissolvable fabrics, the possibilities are only limited by your imagination. Even though much of the embroidery we see today is professionally done by machine, amazing results can still be achieved using hand embroidery techniques. Down through the ages, people have worked with needle and thread to produce clothing and other useful items. However, as time has passed, embroidery has been transformed from a skill of necessity into a highly prized art form. Out of simple needlework, the technique of embroidery has grown beyond all recognition to become a blooming industry that is thriving today. Prolific embroidery artists such as Jan Beanie and Jean Littlejohn have moved the craft from the home to the art gallery and have helped to inspire new generations to pick up a needle and thread to create embroidery masterpieces of their own. If you've always looked longingly at those wonderfully produced hand-embroidered garments and artefacts in high-class designer outlets and wanted to emulate their style at a fraction of the cost, then this programme is definitely for you. Embroidery is, in point of fact, much simpler than you might imagine, and even if you've never sewn a stitch of any description in your life before, then keep watching because you really are in for a treat. The basic list of requirements to get started in embroidery is delightfully short and therefore very encouraging for beginners. Some crafts need all manner of specialist equipment. However, with embroidery, all you need is a thread of some description, a needle, and a piece of fabric to embroider onto. The choice of material is actually quite extensive, and whether you visit a massive superstore or a specialist craft shop, at the outset, keep it simple. Many people like to learn to embroider by using the ready-made kits that are on sale, and these can be perfect to start off with as they have everything in them to complete a specific project. However, when your skills develop, so too will your desire to make more individual pieces of work. With this desire, you will begin to utilise all manner of varied threads, as embroiderers use just about every type of material you can imagine, and a few more besides. Once you have covered the basics, you'll be able to experiment to your heart's content. However, for the time being, we'll get started with an average thickness of cotton thread that's easy to work. But this doesn't have to be boring, Cottons come in a huge array of colours, and some of the finest examples of embroidery are created using only this type of thread. When you go to buy your cotton thread, it will be in bunches, as you see here, and as we're only practicing, choose a plain, simple colour, but do make sure that it's multi-stranded. The reason for multi-strand is vital, particularly if you're going to be embroidering something in cross-stitch, as the number of strands used will determine the thickness of the stitches. Next, we need to move on to the embroidery needles, which you'll notice in many of the shops are kept separate from the usual sewing needles and cost a little bit more as well. It's possible to use everyday sewing needles, however a good quality specialist embroidery needle will really help ease you into the craft. Cheap needles have a tendency to get blunt surprisingly quickly, and they will even break at the end, so it's worth spending a little bit extra, and we are talking just a matter of pennies. Far more important are the different sizes that the needles come in, suitable for different stitch types and thread thickness. But don't worry, if you buy a packet of embroidery needles, it will contain a variety of sizes, which will be fine when you're beginning. Last but not least, you now need your fabric to embroider on, and you can use just about anything you choose. From the traditional muslins and silks right through to Hessian sacks, curtains and even wallpaper and birthday cards, the options are very varied. The art of embroidery has really taken off over the last few years as people are becoming more and more interested in personalising their own clothes. It's possible to add all manner of embellishments and trimmings that turn an inexpensive high street garment into a unique, one-of-a-kind outfit. However, until you've mastered the basic stitches, it's best to stick to practice pieces of fabric. Interestingly, in the past, as young girls learned to stitch, they would embroider samplers, usually of the alphabet, to become proficient, and many antique shops now charge a great deal of money for these historic artifacts. The truth is, you can use any spare fabric you have, but for the purpose of this programme we will be using Ada, a fabric that cross-stitchers use to make it easier to count their stitches. It comes in various sizes and it will help you keep your embroidery straight while you're working out what goes where. Although needle, thread and fabric are the only real essentials, there are other items available that will make life a lot easier and ensure that you get more pleasure than hassle from this delightful pastime. One piece of equipment that many embroiderers wouldn't be without is a fabric frame, because if you want a crease-free and professional-looking piece of embroidery, they are extremely handy. There are many kinds of frame out there on the market. However, for the beginner on a budget, a medium-sized ring frame will do the trick. All you have to do is simply clamp in place the piece of fabric you're using, as you see here, making sure the frame has a good grip on it. It's best to put the smaller ring on a flat surface, stretch the fabric over and then attach the larger ring. It's a good idea to wrap scrap fabric around the inner ring to be really sure of a good grip. Keeping the fabric taut will make it far easier to work with your needle and thread, and when the fabric is securely in the frame, give it a little tap just to be sure that it's drum skin tight. One point to remember here though is to be sure that after each session you take your embroidery out of the frame, otherwise you will get very deep creases that will be hard to iron out when you've finished. It only takes a couple of moments each time and will save you many hours of frustration later on. Also, make sure you've got a really sharp pair of scissors and a bag of some description to keep your embroidery in. This is something that you will pick up and put down as and when you get time to sew, so make sure you can keep it clean. And now, without further ado, we're ready to start embroidering. So we'll begin with simple stitch types, and as we progress, we'll move on to more advanced styles. Some absolutely stunning designs can be made with just a handful of simple stitches though, so don't feel that you have to master all stitch types before starting to create an actual project piece. Of course, before you begin stitching, you'll have to thread your needle, which is an art form in itself at times. Help is at hand though. Just remember to use a sharp pair of scissors and cut the thread cleanly so no strayed bits of fraying yarn are hanging off that can make threading the needle very difficult indeed. Also, on the plus side, embroidery needles usually have fairly large eyes, so all manner of yarns can be used, and a needle actually has a right and wrong side. So if you can't get the thread to go through, turn it around and you should have more luck. Another point to raise here is the fact that many embroiderers don't tie knots in the end of their thread to stop it pulling through. All they do is leave a little of the thread hanging free, and then once they've done a few stitches, it will be set firmly in place. It can be secured into the stitches to finish off tidily later. The reason for this being that not having knots helps to ensure the embroidery lays flat, which is particularly handy if you're planning to frame your work. So now you're ready to begin. The needle is threaded and your fabric is held tight. There are many types of stitches that create all manner of diverse and interesting effects. However, it's best to keep things simple. We'll start with running stitch, which is one of the most common stitch forms, and it's basically one piece of yarn that effortlessly runs in and out of the fabric. Very simply, take your needle and insert it from back to front, then insert the needle from front to back so that your stitch is the desired length. Make the back stitch about half the length or less of the top stitch, and then bring the needle through again to the front. Keep going, ensuring that every one of the top stitches is the same size, with the bottom stitches also matching, and the finished stitch should look a little like perforation marks running around your fabric. A good tip is not to pull the thread through until you have about 3 stitches. Insert the needle in and out a few times as demonstrated here, and then pull all the thread through at the same time. This very simple method will help to make sure your fabric doesn't get puckered, as it's all too easy to pull the running stitch too tight. Running stitch can look too rough for some people, and if you want to create a more seamless effect on your garment, then backstitch is a great way to generate a completely unbroken line. It works in a very similar way to running stitch, but goes back over itself to ensure that there are no gaps in the sewn line. All you do is bring your needle from back to front a little way ahead of where you want the stitch to begin, and then take the thread and with your overstitch sew back and go through the fabric from where the stitch should start. That is one back stitch completed. For the next one, just bring the needle up a little way in front of the end of the first stitch, and just as we did before, sew back and insert the needle from front to back through the point where the first stitch ended. Try to keep all the stitches of the same length all around your design, and as you can see here, it's a very quick way to sew along an edge, and is a popular way for outlining cross-stitch designs when they're finished. A decorative and slightly more complex stitch for outlining is the chain stitch, which uses a hooking technique that many stitches actually employ. Bring the thread up from back to front and pull it through, then straight away insert the needle back through the same spot that it was just inserted through. Now here comes the important part. Don't pull the thread tight. What you want to do is leave a loop visible, like we've done here. When you now bring the needle through again from back to front, catch the loop and pull it taut to create the stitch effect. Next, simply insert the needle back through the same spot and again leave a loop. Carry the chain stitch technique all the way along the rows of stitches and you will have created a very attractive design. Another popular stitch that many people use to add depth and further interest to their embroidery is the French knot. But it will take a little practice to pull off correctly, and just remember to take it nice and slowly to begin with. Bring the needle up again from back to front and pull the thread through, and now comes the slightly tricky bit. With your left thumb if you're right-handed and vice versa if not, hold the thread taut and with the needle facing away from the stitch, twist the yarn around the needle once or twice. Point the needle back towards the hole and insert it as close to the original stitch as possible. Keep holding the thread taut and pull it through very carefully so you create an appealing knot effect on the surface of your embroidery. One of the most common problems you might encounter while perfecting the French knot is pulling the thread too tight and ending up with a loop. Just make sure you construct the knot as close to the fabric surface as you can, taking it nice and slow. Some people find it helps to secure the knot with their thumbnail as they pull the thread through. Then, when the loop has disappeared, simply finish the stitch. If you do make a loop by mistake, just remember not to pull too hard, and you should be able to unpick it quite easily and have another go. We can create all kinds of decorative effects using these 4 fairly simple stitches. Nevertheless, the majority of embroidery designs have filled in areas to create light and shade. Satin stitch is one of the simpler filler stitches and is still one of the most useful to this day. Draw out a small simple shape or make one using a running or back stitch, then simply fill in the space using satin stitch, which is basically any number of stitches positioned next to each other, as you can see here. Bring the needle up at the point that you want your colour to begin, and then insert the needle down and through at the other end of the design. Carry on bringing the needle up through so the following stitch is next to the first stitch, and carry on until the design is filled, not unlike colouring in a shape on paper. Just be sure when you're sewing that the stitches stay very close to each other, keeping in the same direction under steady tension, and don't spread across too wide an area, otherwise the stitches are likely to be pulled out of position. You can use different colours as well if you want to add tone, and once you've mastered satin stitch, if you like the idea of creating your own designs, you'll have a lot of fun. The stitches that we've worked through so far, although very different from each other, are the basic principles of many embroidery techniques. It really won't take long to practice them, and then of course you can move on to variations upon any theme you choose. One such example is a stitch type that has flourished to become an art form in its own right, namely cross stitch, and you can buy kits, books and materials just about everywhere. You may also have heard of needlepoint, which consists of one diagonal stitch, and logically, if you double this, you'll get a cross stitch. This is a very simple stitch, and as you can see, all you need to do is make one diagonal stitch from bottom to top, and then make a diagonal stitch that crosses the first stitch from top to bottom. People make all manner of designs and pictures just with cross stitch, and because the stitches are very close to each other, they give the illusion of one complete mass of colour. If you're completing a whole piece of embroidery with cross stitch, then it's best to use Ada, the material we've been practicing our embroidery on, so that the crosses are the correct size and also lay flat. It looks a little like graph paper and ensures that all the stitches are the same size and are placed the correct distance apart. Also, look out for another fabric called Binka, which has much bigger holes and is especially good for younger embroiderers, and it's what you'll find in cross-stitch kits for children. You can of course use cross stitch in a normal embroidery design on any fabric you like, and it can be a great way of filling space as an alternative to satin stitch. However, if you want to do a whole picture in cross stitch when you're just getting started, stick to the Ada and you won't go far wrong. It will be easier to work with and the finished result will be far more professional, even if it's only your first attempt. A stitch that's not dissimilar to cross stitch is called herringbone and can be very useful indeed. While practicing the herringbone stitch, we're again sticking to the Ada fabric to ensure that the patterning stays the same and doesn't look too messy. With practice, you'll soon be able to do this and keep your lines straight on other fabrics, but do make sure you can execute these stitches with precision first. The herringbone is an intercrossing stitch that creates this familiar looking design, and to get the best effect, try to keep the gaps between all of the stitches the same distance. We then go to the hole on the left and create a diagonal that crosses the original stitch. Again, it's 2 holes along, and we then simply keep repeating the process, crossing over this stitch by starting the new stitch 1 hole back again. If you stitch herringbone over any distance, it will make the well-known zigzag pattern the length of the fabric. We can use a similar stitch type to fill shapes that especially suits leaf work and is called the open fishbone. As you can see, what we do here is take our desired space and use the open fishbone stitch to work our way out from the centre to the outside, remembering to cross the stitches each time in the middle. Pass your needle through in the middle to make the first stitch out, and then go to the other side and bring the needle through again, bringing the thread through and down to cross over the first stitch in the middle. Keep repeating until the whole shape is filled, and as you can see, open fishbone stitch really helps to make the leaf look more realistic, as all the stitches are facing the same way to give the impression of veins. Some stitches look incredibly fancy, although they're actually very simple to pull off. Our next example gives a great looking border to your work, especially if when you get more proficient you use a piece of ribbon or metallic cord instead of your standard embroidery thread. The laced double running stitch is very simply 2 running stitches that are parallel with each other and have a lace running between the 2. Just make sure that you keep your 2 lines of running stitch perfectly in line with each other and ensure that the stitches all match up. Then, when you have your 2 running stitches, take your thread, ribbon or cord and lace it between the 2 rows of stitches. The lace should go through the 2 opposite stitches at a time, like we're doing here, and then go along to the next and the opposite way through. If possible, use a tapestry needle as it has a blunt end, and don't pull the lace too tight, otherwise you will lose this attractive wave effect. There's another form of the laced double running stitch which uses 3 running stitches and is, as you might have expected, called the threaded treble running stitch. It's very easy to see what we've done here, as all you need to do is add an extra line of running stitch, then, as before, thread in and out of the running stitches. It can also look really nice if you work a double lace, which creates the circle effect that we've done here. It produces a very thick border and can also be used for a different style of filling for many designs. There's another stitch that's very similar to the ones just demonstrated, however it's much better suited for filling in more dappled areas of colour rather than picking out borders. The cloud stitch creates a very delicately filled area of shade, and to start off, simply fill the desired space with lots of rows of small vertical stitches. Try to keep the stitches in some form of alternating pattern, otherwise the completed embroidery will look a little rushed. Once you've finished, get a small tapestry needle and, just like the lace double running stitch, weave in and out of the rows with your thread. The cloud stitch is a great technique if you want to fill in a large area quickly, as satin stitch can take a long time because it's so solid. There are actually many variations of the satin stitch, and all of them deviate slightly from the original to create some extremely useful and attractive effects. How about using a sheaf stitch to fill in an area, which looks a little like bales of hay? It's very simply created by making small columns of satin stitches and then tying them together with a couple of overcast stitches. There are 2 ways to do this stitch. You can complete all the vertical stitches first and then go back over them with the overcast stitches, or you can complete each one as you go along. As you see here, we're making a row of 5 stitches and then just looping around the middle of the stitches twice, like so, only piercing the fabric once to come up in the middle of the stitches, and once again when you've looped it twice. We can now just carry on creating sheaf stitches until the chosen area is filled. Just like the sheaf stitch, cluster blocks use equal numbers of satin stitches. Cluster blocking creates a chessboard filling effect and can produce a really striking background for any piece of embroidery. The most common number of stitches used is 5, and it's a good idea to try and make the blocks as square as possible. Work your first block with vertical stitches going from left to right, then work the next block starting in the bottom right hand corner of the first square and stitching down in horizontal lines. When the second block is finished, you can start the third block vertically in the top right hand corner of the second block, and as the cluster blocks build, the effect is really attractive. You can use a variety of colours, and random blocks can produce an interesting finish. Also, you can turn the blocks to give the impression of diamonds rather than squares, and this can be a useful way to ring the changes. Talking of turning blocks on their side, Scottish stitch does a very similar thing. However, instead of turning the blocks on their side, it turns the stitches. It may sound a little confusing, but rest assured it's just as simple as the Closter blocks. Here's an example of a finished bit of Scottish stitching, and as you can see, the stitches run diagonally through the block. Because of this fact, the stitches vary in length as they fill up the square. Just remember, when creating Scottish stitch, to leave small gaps between each diagonal stitch and to also leave a gap between each of the squares. It's best to use Aida or a similarly woven fabric for Scottish stitch, as unfortunately it's all too easy to get the wrong measurements and ruin the entire pattern. Although we leave gaps between each of the stitches in the squares, the spaces between the actual blocks are filled with lots of small diagonal stitches. All we're doing is working our way round the squares like so. On the whole, the stitches are worked around in the same direction as the ones in the squares. However, there is nothing stopping you from stitching in the opposite direction. After you've practiced these stitching skills and techniques, it's well worth experimenting to see what other designs and patterns you can come up with. This is indeed how embroidery has developed into the popular art form it is today. So try some freestyle stitching for yourself. The technical name for the small stitches that go around the squares is tent stitch, and it's another extremely versatile way of embroidering that gets used many times over in different patterns. In some books it will be called needlepoint, the half cross stitch mentioned earlier, or pettipoint. However, just look out for the familiar diagonal stitches that work across the board. Tent stitch is mainly used when working on Aida or canvas, as it's important that all the stitch sizes remain equal and slant in the exact same way. The experienced embroiderer may be able to work tent stitch on other fabrics. However, as we're still practicing, we'll hang on to our guide holes for the time being. A similar stitch that doesn't need to be so mathematically correct is known as seeding, which can be carried out on any material type. Seeding is a great random stitch that's used to fill in spaces, especially if you're making an organic shape like a leaf or a flowing river, as it gives a natural look to the piece. Although the stitches are placed in all manner of random positions over the filled area, it's generally thought that they should be of a uniform size. But again, you can do as you please and experiment with the technique and see what happens. Now, if you asked 100 embroiderers for a favourite stitch, many of them would say Lazy Daisy, because not only is it a lovely stitch, the name is absolutely delightful too. As intricate as this striking design may appear, it is in fact just a variation of the chain stitch that you've already mastered. What you do here is start a chain stitch by producing the loop and still bring the thread from behind to catch the loop. However, instead of inserting the needle back down the same stitch hole, we make a little stitch over the loop, holding it in place. That is the first petal of the daisy created, and now all you have to do is decide how many petals it should have and work your way around until you've created your flower. how about making the petals different colours or sewing a circle in the middle? Once you start using your imagination, it's easy to see just how far you can take your natural creativity with embroidery. Nevertheless, you may find yourself embroidering a gift for someone who isn't the flowery type, so how about using the diamond star stitch instead? You simply make the diamond star out of 8 stitches. The 4 diagonal stitches are slightly smaller than the vertical and horizontal lines, so this helps to give the star effect that we're after. It's best to practice diamond star stitch on some large holed Aida so that you get all the struts of the star in the correct proportions. Diamond star stitch is also meant to use the same hole in the middle, which can be very tricky to do if your thread or needle is too thick. If you're not able to use the same hole all the way around, just try to get the stitches in an even circular motion around the middle, just like we did with the Lazy Daisy. There are plenty more exciting sounding stitches, and a very popular one is the fly stitch, which does borrow from the Lazy Daisy by using the hooking over technique. We'll be working our fly stitch from top to bottom. However, fly stitch can be made to face and indeed work in any direction that you wish to sew. Pass the thread through from back to front again, and then take the stitch over like we're doing here, so it's in line with the first hole but just slightly over to the right. Like many of the other stitches, you need to keep a loop out, so be sure not to pull all the thread through. Now, just like the Lazy Daisy, secure the middle of the loop a little way down so we create a V-shaped stitch. All you need to do now is keep repeating the process. You may want to pack the stitches very close to each other so a kind of wave pattern is created, or spread them further apart, depending of course on how you want your embroidery to look. The fly stitch also lends itself very nicely to the ribbon rose, which is a very elegant stitch that can be used as a filler or as an embellishment by itself. Mark out lightly a circle on your fabric, and as we're just learning how to create the ribbon rose, it's best to start with a small flower. We want to make 5 spokes in the rose that are all equal distances apart, so bear this in mind as we make our first few stitches. Start off as you would for fly stitch at the top of the rose, and then when you have the loop, bring up the needle in the middle of the circle. However, instead of securing it in the middle, make a stitch that goes down to the bottom. We've now created 3 spokes for our circle. All that is left to do for the core structure is create 2 more everyday stitches, just like we're doing here, that have now split up the circle into 5 equal segments. Next step is to fill in the rose. You can either use the thread in your needle, or if the circle is a little too big, a piece of ribbon would be perfect. Basically, weave the ribbon in and out of the spokes, starting in the middle and working your way out. As you do, you will see the rows beginning to take shape, and they can be made in all manner of different sizes and do look wonderful embroidered onto knitwear, and you could even add sequins in the middle if you wanted to. As you've now seen, many of the stitches used in embroidery are simply variations of the first few demonstrated, but now it's time for something a little more challenging. The velvet stitch can look very complicated, but by now you'll be able to cope, as it can be broken down into smaller elements which make up the whole design. The finished effect of the velvet stitch has been likened to carpet pile, and it really adds another dimension to your work. As intricate as velvet stitch looks, the two elements it borrows from are the chain and cross stitch, and once you see how it's done, you'll only take a couple of minutes to pick it up. Velvet stitch works from the bottom up, so find your start position and bring the needle from back to front. Go to make a diagonal stitch, however don't pull the thread all the way through, but leave a little loop hanging. Now we want to repeat this whole stage again, so come up from the same point and make a diagonal stitch in the exact same position. This time, however, pull the thread through, so we should be left with a diagonal stitch and a loop hanging from it. All that is left to do now is complete the other diagonal of the cross stitch, and we've finished our first velvet stitch. Make sure you begin the next velvet stitch from the same hole as the bottom right hand side of the second diagonal stitch to ensure that they remain tightly packed together. Carry on the technique all along the row and then work your way up until you have the whole area finished. Always keep the crosses as close to each other as you can to create a very thick pattern. Once your chosen shape is totally filled in, you can do one of two things with it. Leave the stitching as it is with all the loops, or cut them so there are lots of strands hanging loose. Both of these effects look great, and you can choose whichever suits your work best. So, as you can see, even the most advanced looking stitches are fairly easy to complete. Just remember the basics and the rest will follow with ease. There are hundreds of embroidery stitches, with new ones being thought up all the time. And who knows, with a little practice you too may come up with a stitch that sets a new trend. However, although the techniques are important, embroidery isn't just about learning hundreds of stitches. You can always add a further element to your sewing by using embellishments. Here we've added some beads to each stitch to give the whole piece an extra level of depth. There are all kinds of beads and notions that you can buy from craft shops to stitch into your embroidery, and you're bound to find plenty of options that match your work. Just be sure that they're safe to put through a washing machine though. The last thing you want is your latest masterpiece destroying your brand new washing machine, or equally tragic, vice versa. So far we've concentrated on stitching, and of course these techniques are the backbone of any project. However, once you've mastered the stitches, you'll be ready to take on a project. Before you start, check out your local craft shop because you'll find lots of labour-saving devices that will help you on your way. If you spot an interesting picture in a magazine that you want to turn into an embroidery pattern, you could, if you were a good artist, use an erasable pen and copy the picture onto your fabric ready for embroidering. However, should drawing not be your forte, an excellent tool for embroiderers is dissolvable material. All you have to simply do is print the design onto the sheet and then tack it onto your fabric. Then embroider the design out in whatever way you wish, before simply removing the pins and washing it to dissolve the excess material. You'll be left with a perfectly embroidered garment and not a trace of dissolvable substance. Try experimenting as well by embroidering straight onto the dissolvable material, so all you're left with is the stitching, and machine embroidery is especially good for this. Let's face it, embroidery can be a very lengthy process, which some would argue is what makes it so rewarding. However, there'll be times when you have to fill in what seems like a never-ending expanse of material with a certain stitch type. If you've got a fairly modern sewing machine, chances are it will have a number of simple embroidery stitches that you can use to speed things up. You may not be able to complete whole designs like specialist embroidery machines can, but for most purposes they're just fine. Simply select a stitch type that you want to use to fill in the area and sew away. Even if you only have an old sewing machine, there are many embroiderers who use the normal sewing machine stitch to create all manner of amazing designs and patterns, and machine embroidery is considered, quite rightly, to be equally as skillful as anything crafted by hand. Sadly, our time enjoying the delights of embroidery has come to an end, but as we only touch upon machine embroidery, you can see for yourself that this is a vast subject, and you can spend an entire lifetime discovering new skills to enhance your embroidery. Some folk enjoy dyeing their own threads, or even spinning it themselves in the first place, so quite literally there is no end to the scope that this wonderful art can offer. They say that mighty oaks from tiny acorns grow, and in the case of embroidery, who knows where one tiny running stitch might eventually lead you. But one thing's for sure, you'll definitely enjoy the journey, wherever it takes you.